There's a statue in Barcelona, bronze, commanding, a finger pointed westward toward an ocean that gave him everything and took it all away. But beneath the weathered metal are words that history decided to believe. Here's what they don't tell you in those textbooks, with their glossy illustrations of 3 proud ships cutting through turquoise waters. They don't tell you about the letters, the ones written in his own hand, detailing things so disturbing that even the Spanish crown, who'd sanctioned conquest, who'd blessed slaughter, even they couldn't stomach what he'd become. For 500 years, we've been told a story about discovery, about bravery, about a man who sailed into the unknown and changed the world forever. We've been told wrong. The Christopher Columbus, who died in 1506, bitter, broken, haunted by voices only he could hear, bore almost no resemblance to the ambitious navigator who'd once charmed Spanish royalty. Something happened to him out there in those Caribbean waters, something that transformed curiosity into cruelty, ambition into atrocity. And the people who sent him, they knew, they always knew. They just decided the gold was worth more than the truth. The ending of this story was never about discovery going wrong. It was about discovery going exactly as planned. But the real reason everything collapsed, the one detail that finally destroyed him, that stripped away his titles and sent him back to Spain in literal chains, that's what no one was ever supposed to know. Genoa, 1451. Cristoforo Colombo was born into a world that didn't want him. His father was a weaver, struggling, the kind of man whose hands were stained with dye, whose sons were expected to inherit debt along with the family trade. But Christopher looked at those ledgers and saw something different. He saw that real wealth wasn't in making things, it was in moving things, across water, across borders, across the thin moral line between commerce and conquest. He taught himself to read the stars, to speak Castilian Spanish, with barely a trace of his Genoese accent. He married a Portuguese nobleman's daughter, a strategic union that gave him access to charts, to contacts, to rooms where men in velvet discussed the reshaping of the world. But here's what's disturbing about those early years. Columbus wasn't just ambitious, he was obsessed with a very specific kind of ambition. Not exploration, not knowledge, not even trade. He wanted to be anointed by power, to be chosen, to have kings and queens speak his name with reverence, to transform himself from a weaver's son into something history would remember. That hunger made him useful to the right people, dangerous people, people who understood that a man willing to do anything to escape his origins is a man who'll do anything to justify his existence. By 1485, Columbus had developed a monomania, a single idea that consumed every waking thought. He was going to reach Asia by sailing west. He was catastrophically wrong. His calculations were based on deliberate misreading of ancient texts, on mathematical wishful thinking that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so convenient for certain powerful interests. But this wasn't really about geography. Read his letters. The man was convinced he'd been chosen by God for a divine mission, to find enough gold to fund a new crusade, to reclaim Jerusalem, to usher in the end times. This wasn't a navigator. This was a zealot with navigational skills. January 1492. The Alhambra in Granada. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, were at the height of their power. 700 years of Islamic presence in Iberia had just ended. Spain was unified. The kingdom was broke. That's the part they don't emphasize. All that warfare had drained the treasury. They needed money, desperately. Enter Columbus for the 4th or 5th time. He'd been rejected before. In Portugal, experts had calculated his distances and dismissed him as either a fool or a fraud. In Spain, Isabella's advisors had done the same. But now, with the treasury empty and the church demanding expansion, Columbus's terrible mathematics suddenly looked less like a miscalculation and more like an opportunity. If he was wrong about the distance, he'd simply die at sea, problem solved. But if he found land out there, that was worth 3 ships and a crew of convicts. The deal was historic. Columbus demanded and received titles that would make him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he discovered, and a 10% cut of all wealth forever. Inheritable. It gave Columbus almost unlimited authority over any people he encountered, the power to enslave, to punish, to rule as he saw fit, accountable only to monarchs thousands of miles away. They were handing absolute authority to a man whose primary qualification was his willingness to risk everything on a probably suicidal voyage. The 12th of October, 1492, after 33 days sailing west, a lookout spotted land, an island the indigenous Taíno people called Guanahani. Columbus renamed it San Salvador and claimed it for Spain without asking the people living there. The Taíno who came to greet the ships were peaceful, curious, generous. They wore gold ornaments. They had no weapons. They approached the bearded strangers with gifts. Columbus's first written observation about them is chilling. They should be good servants and intelligent, for I observed that they quickly took in what was said to them, and I believe that they would easily be made Christians. Not these are human beings, not this is a thriving culture. They should be good servants. That was day one. Columbus was convinced he'd reached Asia. He expected to find the court of the Great Khan, cities of gold, the spice kingdoms Marco Polo had described. Instead, he found people living in harmony with their environment, with no concept of private property, no standing armies, no fortifications. To a zealot raised in a culture of conquest, this wasn't paradise. It was vulnerability, opportunity. He took several Taíno captive immediately to serve as interpreters, he claimed. 6 would survive the journey back to Spain. The rest died of European diseases, or from despair, or from the simple, brutal fact of being chained in a ship's hold. On Christmas Eve, his flagship ran aground and sank. Columbus was forced to leave 39 men behind at a hastily constructed fort he named La Navidad, Christmas. When he sailed back to Spain in January 1493, he brought gold samples, exotic birds, and 7 surviving Taíno captives. He was received as a hero. But Columbus knew something no one else did. He knew the gold was scarce. He knew the islands weren't Asia. He knew his calculations had been catastrophically wrong, and that he'd only survived because an entire continent he didn't know existed happened to be in the way. And he knew that when he returned, he'd have to produce results that justified the investment, the titles, the promises, no matter what it cost. November 1493. Columbus's second voyage carried 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This wasn't exploration anymore. This was colonization. When they reached La Navidad, the fort was ash. All 39 men were dead. The Taíno had learned what European hospitality meant. The sailors left behind had raped women, stolen gold, taken slaves, murdered anyone who resisted. The indigenous people had finally retaliated. Columbus, standing in the ruins, made a calculation that would echo through 5 centuries of colonial horror. He decided the Taíno had committed an act of war, which meant everything that followed would be justified as retaliation, as self-defense. Michele de Cuneo, a childhood friend who sailed on the second voyage, wrote letters home describing the pacification campaigns. He described hunting Taíno for sport. He described a woman given to him as a slave whom he raped, detailing the violence with a casualness that suggests he expected no judgment. Columbus established a tribute system. Every Taíno person over 14 was required to deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. Those who complied received a copper token to wear around their necks. Those who didn't had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death as a warning to others. But here's the horror that even that obscures. There wasn't enough gold. There had never been enough gold. The Taíno had small amounts, decorative pieces, nothing like the wealth Columbus had promised. So the tribute became impossible. The punishments became routine. The mutilations became policy. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who witnessed these events, wrote that he saw piles of severed hands stacked like cordwood. He described mothers killing their own infants rather than watch them grow up under Spanish rule. He described mass suicides, entire village drinking cassava poison together, choosing death over slavery. The Taíno population of Hispaniola in 1492 is estimated between 250,000 and 1 million people. By 1548, fewer than 500 remained. An entire culture erased in 2 generations. But Columbus wasn't just killing them, he was selling them. In 1495, facing pressure to deliver profits, Columbus filled 4 ships with 550 enslaved Taíno and sent them to Spain to be sold in Seville's markets. 200 died during the crossing. The survivors were paraded through the streets, naked and chained, while merchants evaluated their teeth and muscles like livestock. Queen Isabella was horrified. She'd authorized conversion, not enslavement. She ordered them freed and returned. But the orders arrived too late for most. And Columbus, thousands of miles away, simply ignored the ones that did arrive. Because he'd discovered something more valuable than gold. He'd discovered that the distance between Spain and Hispaniola wasn't just geographical, it was moral. Out there, beyond immediate oversight, he could become what he'd always wanted to be: absolute, unquestioned, divine. Spanish settlers began writing letters home, complaining, accusing. Columbus responded by making examples. He hanged Spanish men for minor infractions, had others whipped publicly, cut off the nose and ears of a woman accused of lying about being pregnant to avoid work. The settlement at Hispaniola became a laboratory of colonial violence. Every technique that would later devastate the Americas was tested there first. Forced labor in mines, systems that were slavery by another name, deliberate starvation as control, sexual violence as subjugation. And through it all, Columbus wrote letters to the crown describing a paradise of opportunity, of souls saved for Christ, of wealth just over the next horizon. He blamed any problems on the laziness of the Taino, on the ingratitude of his settlers, on insufficient support from the monarchs. Never on himself. The year 1500 marked the beginning of the end. Ferdinand and Isabella dispatched Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal investigator, to Hispaniola, with full authority to examine Columbus's governance. Bobadilla arrived to find 7 Spanish corpses hanging from gallows in the town square. Fresh bodies. Columbus's brothers had executed them that morning for rebellion. What followed was a reckoning. Bobadilla interviewed colonists, compiled testimony, examined the tribute records, the punishment logs, the mass graves. He documented a governor who'd created a regime of terror so complete that even the Spanish settlers were terrified. Men described watching Columbus order the torture of a Spanish woman, having her stripped naked and paraded on a donkey. They described him threatening to cut out tongues, to hang anyone who questioned his authority. They described a man who'd convinced himself that he answered only to God. Bobadilla's report was devastating. But he didn't just write it. He arrested Christopher Columbus, he arrested his brothers, and he put them in chains. Actual iron shackles, wrist and ankle, the kind reserved for common criminals. The admiral of the ocean sea was sent back across the Atlantic in the ship's hold, chained like the slaves he'd once shipped to Seville's markets. The ship's captain offered to remove the chains once they were at sea. Columbus refused. He'd wear them all the way to Spain. He'd present himself to the monarchs in irons, a visual argument that he was the victim of persecution. It was brilliant theatre. It almost worked. Isabella and Ferdinand received him with pity. They ordered him freed. They listened to his explanations, his promises that he'd been undermined. But they didn't restore his governorship. They stripped Columbus of his administrative authority while allowing him to keep his titles and his percentage of profits. The message was clear: you can be wealthy, but you can never rule again. You can never be trusted with power over human lives. May 1502. Columbus, now 50 and suffering from arthritis that had gnarled his hands into claws, convinced the crown to fund a 4th voyage, not to govern, to explore, to find a passage to Asia that would finally vindicate him. It was a disaster from the start. A hurricane destroyed one ship. Local indigenous groups refused to trade. His crew grew mutinous. His body was failing. Letters describe him unable to sleep, racked with pain, possibly experiencing symptoms of inflammatory disease that can cause hallucinations. He heard voices, saw visions, believed God was speaking to him directly. They were shipwrecked off Jamaica. For a year, they were stranded. Columbus, desperate to maintain control, performed what he claimed was a miracle. He predicted a lunar eclipse using his astronomical tables. He told the local people that his God would devour the moon if they didn't provide food. The eclipse happened. The terrified Taino supplied provisions. Columbus used astronomical knowledge to manipulate and threaten people who'd done nothing to him. It's a perfect distillation of everything his voyages represented. European knowledge deployed not for understanding, but for domination. When rescue finally arrived in June 1504, he returned to Spain broken. Isabella died that same year. Ferdinand was happy to let the admiral fade into irrelevance. Columbus spent his final 18 months writing increasingly desperate letters, demanding his governorship be restored, claiming he'd been betrayed, insisting that history would vindicate him. He died in Valladolid on the 20th of May, 1506. Not in poverty, he died wealthy, but in obscurity. His death merited no state funeral, no period of mourning. The man who'd changed the world died believing the world had forgotten him. Here's what they tell you. Columbus died in bed, having discovered the New World, having earned his place among the greatest explorers who ever lived. Here's what they don't tell you. He died partially blind, his hands so deformed he couldn't write, hearing voices that accused him of crimes he could no longer deny. His final written works, the Book of Prophecies, read like the ravings of someone whose mind had fractured. He compared himself to biblical figures. He claimed his voyages had been foretold by Isaiah, that he was an instrument of divine will, that the suffering he'd caused was necessary for salvation and the coming end times. He calculated that the world would end in 1656. This wasn't reflection. This was a man who'd gone so far beyond moral boundaries that the only way he could psychologically survive was to convince himself it had all been God's plan. But the world didn't need Columbus to understand what he'd been. The evidence was written in mass graves across Hispaniola, in the testimonies of men who'd served under him and returned home unable to sleep, in the empty villages, in the silence where hundreds of thousands of voices had once existed. The Taino language is extinct. Their cultural practices, their stories, their understanding of medicine and agriculture and astronomy gone, not gradually, through deliberate, systematic destruction in service of gold extraction and colonial profit. Columbus didn't discover America. You can't discover a place where millions of people already live. What he did was weaponize European technology and disease against populations who'd never developed defenses against either. And the Spanish crown? They knew. They commissioned reports. They received testimonies. They read Bartolomé de las Casas's brutal documentation of genocide. And they calculated that the wealth flowing from the Caribbean justified ignoring it all. By the 1542nd, indigenous population collapse was so severe that Europeans began importing enslaved Africans to replace the workforce dying in the mines and fields. The transatlantic slave trade was partially a response to Columbus's successful extermination of the labor force he'd been granted authority over. This is the collapse, not of Columbus, he was always small, always temporary. The collapse of an entire hemisphere's worth of human cultures, languages, and ways of being. And it happened within a single lifetime. For centuries, Europeans told themselves a comfortable story. That colonization was complicated, that there were good intentions mixed with unfortunate excesses, that this was all somehow inevitable. Columbus became a symbol of this narrative. In the 1800s, as the United States sought historical figures to mythologize, Columbus was rehabilitated. Not the Columbus of the Spanish archives, who ruled through terror and died in disgrace, but Columbus, the brave explorer, Columbus the visionary. Italian Americans, facing horrific discrimination in early 20th century America, elevated Columbus as one of their own. Columbus Day became a celebration of ethnic pride. The indigenous people whose ancestors Columbus had systematically destroyed weren't consulted. This is the dark genius of how empire sustains itself. Not by hiding the evidence the documents exist, historians know exactly what happened, but by burying the truth under mythology, under tradition, under the claim that questioning foundational stories is somehow unpatriotic. But here's what's not anachronistic. The contemporaries of Columbus were horrified. Queen Isabella ordered indigenous people freed. Bartolomé de las Casas spent 50 years documenting the atrocities. Spanish theologians used Columbus's actions to develop some of the first international law concepts about indigenous rights. People in the 1500s knew Columbus had crossed every moral line. They knew what he'd done was evil, even by the standards of a time that accepted slavery and religious persecution. We don't get to claim we didn't know better. Our ancestors knew better. They just decided the profits were worth more than the conscience. Once you understand what Columbus actually did, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. The Belgian Congo, where King Leopold II created a private slave state that killed 10 million people for rubber. The British Raj, where deliberate policy caused famines that killed tens of millions. The Aboriginal stolen generations. the residential schools, the Holocaust's operational techniques, borrowed from colonial administrative methods. Every single one follows the same logic. Columbus pioneered: identify a population as less than fully human, create legal structures that deny their rights, deploy violence to extract resources, and build mythologies that justify it all as progress. And every single time, there were people, contemporaries, who said this was wrong, who documented the cruelty, who argued for basic human dignity, who were ignored because acknowledging them would have required abandoning the prophets. The choice to ignore them wasn't made in the past. It's made every day we teach children about Columbus the explorer without Columbus the enslaver. Every day, a city maintains a statue without a plaque explaining what the person actually did. Every day we celebrate discovery without mourning destruction. Here's what Columbus was ultimately remembered for. Despite everything he'd hoped, he opened a door. Not to Asia, not to wealth, not to the theological redemption he'd convinced himself was his divine purpose. He opened a door to the possibility of treating entire categories of humans as resources. He proved that distance could grant immunity from moral accountability. He demonstrated that sufficient violence, backed by sufficient legal authority, could accomplish almost anything, and that history would eventually find ways to justify it. The world changed because of Columbus, just not in the way the statues suggest. It changed because he showed European powers what was possible when moral restraints were an ocean away from oversight. When an entire hemisphere of people could be reconceptualized, not as neighbors to be met, but as obstacles to be cleared or assets to be claimed. He died hearing voices, his mind fractured by disease, and possibly by guilt he could never quite suppress, despite all his theological rationalizations. He died wealthy but powerless, celebrated but constrained, having achieved everything he'd wanted except the one thing that might have redeemed him: genuine reflection on what he'd actually done. They thought they'd be remembered for discovery. History remembered them for genocide. And the most disturbing part? It took 500 years for that history to even start telling the truth. 500 years of statues and holidays and heroic narratives before enough people said, wait, maybe we should talk about the mass graves. Maybe we should mention the testimony. Columbus didn't discover America. He inaugurated its conquest. He didn't brave unknown waters to expand human knowledge. He weaponized European technology against populations who'd welcomed him with gifts. And every year we celebrate him. We choose the mythology over the truth. We choose the comfort of heroic narratives over the discomfort of honest reckoning. That choice to prioritize our inherited stories over documented reality that's not about the past. That's about who we are right now, what we value, what we're willing to ignore for the sake of comfortable tradition. Columbus proved something terrible about human nature, that with enough distance, enough legal authority, and enough economic incentive, ordinary people will commit extraordinary evil and call it progress. The voices he heard in his final years, the ones that kept him awake, that drove him to write increasingly desperate theological justifications, maybe they weren't illness at all. Maybe they were the only honest thing left in him, the part that knew exactly what he'd become, even if he could never admit it while he lived. The part that understood the cost of everything he'd achieved, measured in lives and languages, and entire ways of being human that would never exist again because he'd needed to prove he mattered. History remembers, not always accurately, not always quickly, not always fairly, but eventually it remembers. And Christopher Columbus, who wanted to be remembered as the man who discovered a new world, he'll be remembered as the man who destroyed one, forever.